We're now in the color grading tab of Lightroom. It used to be called split toning, but they made some upgrades, and it really is an awesome panel here in the Lightroom software. So let's go ahead and take a look at all of its features. There's a few ways of viewing this panel. So if we click the three circles here, we get our midtones, shadows, and highlights color wheels all on one tab, along with luminance sliders. Down here we have blending and balance. This affects everything globally, no matter which one of these circle tabs we're in. Blending controls the transition from shadows to highlights, and if you go to the left, the transition is going to be harsher, and to the right, it'll be a smoother, more gradient transition. We'll take a look at that more in depth here in a minute. And balance is just whether we want to emphasize our color grade towards the shadows or more towards the highlights. And we'll look at that further in a minute as well. Moving through the tabs, we can see each color wheel individually. This is how I prefer to work in the color grading tab, because now you've added the hue and saturation sliders as well as the luminance. And it is the same for midtones and highlights. All the way to the right, we have the global adjustment tool, which will affect everything globally across the entire image. You can double click here where it says global to reset the wheel. So there's a couple ways to control these color wheels. You can click on the center point and drag it out to the edge of the wheel to increase saturation of a color. And you can click on the point just outside of the color wheel and drag it around to dial in the color you want, reset. Or you can do the same thing with the sliders, which is how I prefer to work. I think it is a little bit easier to control. So you can see as I move the saturation slider out, it's moving that center point to the outer edge of the color wheel. And as I move the hue slider around, it moves that outer point to select your color. So that is how the color grading tab works. Let's dive on over here into our first point, which is shadows. You have a little box here. You can do some presets. Got white, yellow, a pinkish, a light blue, and it looks like a lighter blue. And I think I want to go something a little more turquoise though. So we're going to come over here. Let's use our hue slider. Dial in the color we want. We got our saturation slider just around 20. Actually, I'm at 19. I want to lift the shadows just a little bit. If I go too far, they start to look a little washed out. That is pretty good on the shadow end. Now we're going to hop on over to our midtones. And there's actually kind of a hidden feature here. If we look back at our histogram from our first video and look at this middle portion here, we notice it's called exposure. To the left of that is shadows, and to the right is highlights. There is nothing in the histogram dedicated to midtones. And if we move this section to the right or the left, it affects the whole picture globally. But if you come down here to midtones, we now have a luminance slider for midtones. And if I move that to the left or the right, watch our histogram. We're mainly just moving the midtones instead of globally adjusting the brightness of the image. So that is really a neat feature here, to have a luminance slider finally for the midtones, and it is in the color grading tab. I'm going to reset our midtones, reset our histogram, and let's look for a midtone color that we like. I'm going to take my saturation up pretty high as I search for the color. I want something in the orangish reddish range. And now I'm going to take that saturation back so it looks more natural. And I want to take up my luminance quite a bit. That's looking pretty good. Now we'll hop on over to the highlights. And we can turn off these effects to see what we've done. With a little switch here, turn off color grading effects. And this is available in most of the panels to see your before and after. So I think I want to go with a lighter orange, maybe a little bit more towards yellow in the highlights. Let's lift our saturation and find that color. Something about right there. Now we'll dial our saturation back. And I'm going to lift the luminance quite a bit. So overall, this is looking pretty good, but now we're going to dial it in with our blending and balance. So if I take the blending to the left, we get kind of a more contrasty, harsher gradient in the changes we've made. Whereas I take it to the right, it's a little smoother of a gradient in the changes. I want to take it to the left, and I think I want to balance this more towards the highlights. So not quite that far, but to show you the effect. Whereas if I took it towards the shadow, we're now more favoring the changes we made towards the shadows. Take this about there, and that is looking pretty good. I'm going to take one more look back here at our shadows luminance and lift it just a little more. Now we can see our before and after. Liking that quite well. We could, if we wanted at this point, give the overall picture a color cast. Let's lift our saturation and play with the hue slider. Actually, I'm kind of liking this blue color cast. I'm going to take the luminance slider and dial it down just a little bit so we get a little more contrast between our shadows and highlights. And there we are, the final image before and after.